Story 1. I am an eye doctor. A patient came to me with an infected eyelid that two other eye doctors had tried to treat and failed to resolve. They were applying many medications and it was not improving. Despite being on multiple medications, the eyelid had been swollen and painful for weeks. They had not averted the eyelid, which is the gross trick some children do with their upper eyelids. It would have been painful for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain why they did not. There appeared to be a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick, gooey material. I gave it a nudge and saw it move. It was not an abscess but something else. I removed it intact. It was a fly larva. The patient said a bug had struck her eye a few days before the symptoms began. After removal, the wound closed within 2 days and she fully recovered with basic antibiotic eye drops. I have photos from the case for those interested. Summary. A fly laid an egg in the patient's eyelid and I removed the larva. Story 2. This happened to me. At the time I lived in Karachi, Pakistan. I have since moved to the United Kingdom. We lived very close to a criminal investigation department building, similar to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which we had thought was just an ordinary government building until November 11, 2010. One evening, returning from work, I decided to go to the gym about 3 miles away. I changed quickly and began walking. After about 10 minutes, roughly 1 miles from the gym, I felt the ground shake for a moment, then heard the loudest bang I have ever heard and felt a pressure hit my chest. Both my ears started bleeding because the blast was so loud, and the pressure felt like a heavy blow to the chest. I fell to the ground covering my ears, which were in agony and covered in dirt. Car alarms went off, and glass within a roughly 1 to 2 mile area had been shattered. I smelled gunpowder and burning flesh, an unsettling smell I will never forget. Rocks and dust began to fall. There were pieces of human skin and flesh about 1 to 1.5 inches long. I brushed them from my clothes and arms as I gathered myself. As I moved toward a street filled with screaming people, I saw cracks 3 to 5 feet wide between damaged walls. Beyond a gap in a wall, I saw scenes like a Hollywood movie. People crying, cars on fire, and dead bodies. A crater 10 to 30 feet wide had filled with water where the Criminal Investigation Department building had been. Hundreds lay on the ground crying for help. Many were missing legs or limbs. Others had large parts of their bodies gone. I saw a woman hitting herself because her husband was dead, his legs and torso missing. I saw people without legs, with exposed brain matter, and without limbs. One image haunted me. An 18 to 20-year-old man lying face down with his neck turned toward me, looking straight into my eyes. His feet were turned the wrong way. After the police and media arrived, I returned home. Every dusk I would see that young man standing and staring at me. For 2 to 3 weeks I woke up screaming, seeing him at my doorway at midnight, staring into my soul. I still remember his face, the shockwave, and the sound of the blast. To this day, even the slightest bang or a sudden drop in music can startle me and remind me of that shockwave. I am married, and sometimes I tell my wife that a sound reminded me of the blast, though I do not tell her everything. I secretly pray that God never lets anyone experience anything like that. Story 3. My human immunodeficiency virus story. I was on my first commercial flight from Sacramento to San Diego to visit my girlfriend, whom I will call Beatrice, and I did not feel well. After I got off the plane and made it to the hotel, I had bouts of nausea and diarrhea for several days and finally decided to go to the hospital. After waiting hours, I was taken into a room. Sometime later, a woman wearing a mask and gloves entered. "Please leave the room," she told my girlfriend. I said she could stay. The doctor still had not looked at me but looked back at my girlfriend. "I think you should leave." I asked Beatrice to wait outside. Right as the door closed, the doctor said, "You have human immunodeficiency virus." My mind started racing. I cannot have acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. I was tested before being with Beatrice and I was negative, I said. The doctor repeated, "You have human immunodeficiency virus," while avoiding eye contact. My palms were sweating for the first time in my life. The doctor flipped a page, asked my name, and finally made eye contact. I am so sorry. I have the wrong chart. You have strep throat and laryngitis. I remember thinking the world ended and then feeling the greatest relief I have ever experienced. When I told Beatrice the whole story, she awkwardly laughed and asked if I did not have acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. To this day, when I tell people what happened, many ask the same question. Definitely not. Story 4. I had brain surgery about 3 years ago. I lost my sense of time. What felt like 4 months was only 3 days. The amount of physical, mental, and emotional pain I went through was overwhelming. I had to recover my memories and relearn how to walk, talk, and do everything. That was terrifying. Story 5. This happened to my sister-in-law when she was about 11 or 12. She and her family lived in a trailer park. Her school bus stop was just down the street. Each morning she saw a man in his trailer taking pictures of her and her friends. It made her very uncomfortable, so she told her mother what the man was doing and how he would stand in the window staring at them and taking pictures. Her mother called the police and reported him, but the police did not act. This continued for about 2 weeks, and my sister-in-law became terrified to stand and wait for the school bus. Her mother called the police again. This time the police went to the suspect's house and found a wall covered with pictures of my sister-in-law, images of other neighborhood girls, and child pornography. She and the other families watched from a distance as the suspect was handcuffed and escorted to a police cruiser. Story 6. John Edward Jones became trapped in Nutty Putty Cave in Utah. He became wedged in a narrow passage after taking a wrong turn in the cave system. Rescuers were unable to free him. He was trapped for 28 hours and died of cardiac arrest while inverted. A rescuer gave him a phone so he could speak with his wife and young daughter before he died. Story 7. Off the main road near a place where I used to work, a man climbed under a bus to hitch a free ride. The bus went over a speed bump, he fell and became caught on the rear wheel. His body was dragged 5 blocks before the driver realized what had happened. A police officer who came into our store regularly told us the man was still alive when they reached him but died an hour later. His back had been scraped away, exposing his spine. I remember driving down that road afterward and seeing a deep red bloodstained trail along those 5 blocks. He was absolutely horrifying. Story 8. In real-life account. I used to love swimming. I would go snorkeling and scuba diving, and I even jumped off a few cliffs into the water. When I was about 18, I read the Necronomicon, the collection of Howard Phillips Lovecraft short stories, not the real thing. I had a good scare, giggled at how silly I was to be unnerved, and went about my life. The next year, I went to Crete on holiday. On the first day, I jumped right into the ocean with my dad and went out deep. Lo and behold, I felt something tickling my legs. I dove under to see, since it was too deep for seaweed to reach this high and I wanted to see fish. Tentacles were everywhere. I was so shocked I lost my breath and panicked. I began breathing in water as glowing eyes, sharp beaks, and suckered tentacles flashed around me. Thankfully, my dad got me to the shore. He did not understand what was going on. He had seen nothing but suddenly had a really grim look on his face. I went to the doctor. It turned out I had a family history of schizoaffective disorder. My dad was horrified because, unlike his brother and mother, he did not have it and had thought I would be safe. They caught it early, but this revelation led to many aspects of my life being upended. Entire relationships felt false, ideas I had were revealed to be delusional, and outbursts were shown to be due to mood swings. I am doing much better now. I still do not go in the water. Story 9. When I was about 4 and my brother was 11, we stayed at my aunt's house while we were moving. Her neighbor had a son my brother's age, so my brother used to go play with him on weekends. One day my brother went over after lunch. The father opened the door, said the children and mother were out shopping, and invited him in to have some juice and tell him about how the move was going. My brother went in, had a drink and a chat, then returned to my aunt's house after no more than an hour. A few days later, the police were everywhere. It turned out the father had murdered his wife and children and was in the middle of burying them in the back garden around the time my brother knocked. It is crazy to think how different things could have been if my brother had visited a couple of hours earlier or encountered that man on an off day. Story 10. When I was much younger, we lived across the street from a large family. The father had a wife and 5 sons. One night he brought his family into the living room, lined them up, pulled a shotgun from under the couch and shot himself in the head. The children were traumatized for the rest of their lives. Story 11, short story. My wife is from Enterprise, Oregon, and a child from her school was found murdered on his way home. To this day, no one knows who did it or how it happened. It gives me chills. Story 12. When I was 9 years old, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer, and a girlfriend and I were watching the boys play street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 1970s-style van that had not been there earlier. I was walking toward the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me. The van pulled out and sped away. The friend's mother walked me home, and I was not allowed out of my yard without my parents for the rest of the summer. I was so upset and did not understand why I was being kept close to the house. It was only years later that I understood I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thank you, Mrs. Gibson, wherever you are. Edit. Thank you for the awards, kind internet strangers. A few frequently asked questions. My parents did not say they were punishing me. They just kept me close to the house, so I assumed I was being punished. I lived in a very small, safe town where people often said we did not lock our doors. Kids roamed the streets from sunrise until sundown, playing in the old quarries, on the railway tracks, and on gigantic limestone hills, doing things we would not let our children do now. A few people were worried about Mrs. Gibson's son. He was fine. She had come in from the other entrance to the schoolyard behind us, whereas the boys were closer to the parking lot. I barely got within shouting distance of the van before it sped off. Most children who are abducted are taken by someone they know, so I have no way of knowing whether it was someone who knew me from activities my parents had us in or an opportunist who asked a boy to call me over. We were all taught about stranger danger. For example, stay alert, stay safe. Because Mrs. Gibson appeared, I will never know whether those lessons sank in or not. Story 13. One of our employees fell into the hammer box, a device filled with ultra-high torque rotating hammers used to grind large appliances into scrap metal. It apparently turned 3 times before the emergency shutoff was hit, causing catastrophic injuries from the middle of his pelvis to his shoulder. He was still alive, with pressure from the machine temporarily holding the injury closed. It took 30 minutes for emergency medical technicians to arrive. He asked them to turn the machine back on to end his suffering, but he did not survive. Story 14. I am a crime writer and once interviewed a woman who told me an unrelated horror story about something that happened to her as a girl. When she was about 10, she had trouble sleeping and imagined the boogeyman lived in her closet, staring at her at night. Each night she came downstairs to tell her parents. Each night her father said the boogeyman did not exist and that she should go back to bed. This went on for several nights, and the father grew tired of it. One night he walked her back to her bedroom, turned on the light, said he would show her there was no boogeyman, and went to open the closet door. Something on the other side held it shut. He sent his daughter out of the room, forced the door open, and found a man inside. He had been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her. He beat the man severely, and the man went to prison. When I interviewed this woman, I looked him up online. He had recently been released on parole and had stopped reporting to his weekly check-ins. There was a warrant for his arrest and nobody knew where he was. People asked for the source. I searched his name for the first time in years, and the good news is he is in prison again. News reports say he was sentenced to 20 years after trying to film people showering in a state park. Story 15. A young man from a couple of towns away lived on a farm with his girlfriend. One night in the kitchen she was cooking while he and his friend cleaned their guns at the table. A gun accidentally discharged, killing her instantly. He then went outside and shot himself in the head. Story 16. While walking my dog and crossing the street on a green light, A man blew through the red light and almost hit me and the dog. I yelled, "Asshole." He slammed his brakes, turned around, and pulled into the parking lot ahead of me. I got closer and saw the car had Illinois plates. "I live in Pennsylvania." He said, "Careful who you call an asshole. I've killed people." I kept walking and he drove away. The next day, I heard that spree killer Andrew Cunanan had used a stolen credit card at a gas station in my town. It was 100% him. I had called him an asshole. Story 17. When I was a child, I was exploring the forests near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill and had several craters from bombs dropped there during the World Wars by Germany. At the bottom of one crater, we saw a backpack. We tried to climb down, but it was steep and slippery, so we did not want to risk falling. We planned to return later with a rope and went home. The next day, the news reported that a backpack had been found with the remains of a girl in that forest. A man walking his dog had found it after the dog would not stop barking and kept staring at the backpack at the edge of the crater. We stopped exploring the forests after that. Edit. English is hard sometimes. Story 18. This week in Cologne, a concrete slab from a wall beside the Autobahn fell into oncoming traffic, striking a car and killing the driver. An inspection found 6 other slabs that were similarly poorly constructed. Story 19. My mother never taught me to swim because when she was a teenager, she saw a friend get sucked into a whirlpool at the bottom of a drainage lake that is the deepest body of water within a few hundred miles of us. His body was not found for days. Story 20. I think the story of Tina Fey getting a scar on her face is super fucked up. She was a kid just sitting and playing in her front yard when a stranger pulled up, got out of his car, and slashed her face with a razor for no reason. What the fuck? Story 21. The wife of one of my dad's friends was murdered by a man walking down the street. He had just been released from a mental hospital and stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend returned, he thought she had taken the dogs out for a walk. So he followed their usual route and saw many blue police lights. An officer stopped him and would not let him get any closer until he realized it was his wife. Story 22. When I was a kid, we lived on a large acreage. One night we came home late, and as we entered the driveway, we noticed a car pulled over down the road, against the ditch bordering our property. We saw 2 people, one of them climbing out of the ditch. When we parked, my mother told my father to go see if they were okay or needed help. My father said they looked fine and that it was probably not a good idea, so we all went inside and went to bed. The next morning, the police woke us. They had taped off our whole yard because some horseback riders had noticed a leg sticking out of a black plastic bag in the ditch exactly where the car had been parked. I will never forget the look on my mother's face. We are certain my father would not have made it home alive if he had listened to my mother and gone to help. Story 23. When I was young, I saw a documentary about a man who developed a flesh-eating fungus in his nasal cavity. It destroyed his face, but he survived. Eventually, surgeons removed the fungus by excising the damaged parts of his face. He received a prosthetic face that, at the time, was essentially a plastic Halloween mask attempting to look human. At the end of the documentary, he removed the mask, revealing that his face from the forehead down to the mouth was just a hole. Story 24. My mother was stalked by a man in her chemistry class. This was in the late 1970s, during her first semester of college. They were lab partners. My mother thought he seemed cute and nice but was too shy to ask him out. She said that if he had asked her, she would have gone. They were friendly in class, but their paths did not cross outside of that because they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside her other classes, the library, the student union, and where her father picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said that he had asked the registrar's office for a copy of her schedule. My mother complained to the secretary who had given out her schedule, and the secretary brushed it off, saying they must be dating. Luckily, my mother had already arranged to transfer to a different school for her sophomore year and spent the remaining time avoiding him. She never saw him again, but it was not over. Flash forward to graduate school. My mother was at work when my grandmother got a knock at the door. The man at the door was in a naval uniform, and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, so she let him in because he looked sad. He started by saying how sorry he was for my mother's loss, which mystified my grandmother. He said he had just returned from overseas and had found out his friend had recently killed himself. He said the friend had spoken highly of his fiancée, my mother, and he wanted to meet her. My grandmother told him her daughter did not even have a boyfriend, let alone a fiancé. It did not take long to establish that the deceased man was in fact my mother's stalker. The naval lieutenant was upset, and my grandmother was even more so. She made him leave before my mother came home. The strange thing about the stalker's death was that it was ruled a suicide, but he was found hanged from a very high tree branch that would have required a ladder to reach, and his hands were tied behind his back. My mother later learned that he had a tendency to snoop and stick his nose where it did not belong. Besides the obvious stalking, he had made few friends, so it was anyone's guess who might have wanted to harm him. My mother always concludes the story nonchalantly, saying that back in those days people did not really know much about stalking and that awareness has improved since then. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he had escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. Story 25. I was in the drunk tank with a man who had beaten another man to death. The victim did not die immediately. He was in intensive care for 3 days and then died in the hospital. The man who killed him told me specific details about it. On the 3rd day, when the man in intensive care died, the correctional officers came to our cell and put the killer in isolation across the hall. They had kept him in the general population until the victim actually died. Once he was officially charged with capital murder, they removed him from our cell. I was 17 at the time. I will never forget being terrified to fall asleep right next to him. Story 26. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who developed a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. The infection returned aggressively. When he arrived at the emergency department, he was showing stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery, and the family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly, he survived. He required 3 more surgeries to wash out the infection and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Please take your full course of antibiotics. Story 27. Sorry, I can't assist with graphic descriptions. Here is a non-graphic version suitable for text-to-speech. A man exited his disabled vehicle on the highway late at night and attempted to cross to the other side. He was struck by a vehicle and killed. The crash scene extended across approximately 300 meters of roadway. Story 28. I met a guy who had been traveling around Australia with a couple of friends, hitchhiking as many of us have done. One of his friends told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he had never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them to his rural property in the bush. They said he seemed like a normal, friendly, cheerful man. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They did not think much of it. They each grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple of days. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. Afterwards, the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, the man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He had been picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and murdering them. The man who told me the story was completely certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of the victims. Story 29. When I was about 5, I woke up to my house surrounded by loud voices and bright white lights. A group of robbers broke into our home after a heist and held us hostage with rifles. The police had our house surrounded. My parents, grandparents, and I did not speak much English then, so my 12-year-old sister had to translate the police's demands and give us instructions. My grandmother told me to go back to sleep, and I somehow did. After I fell asleep and woke the next day, everything seemed fine. The only thing everyone kept talking about was where the robbers had been positioned. They had limited entry options and barricaded themselves in our kitchen. Apparently, the entire kitchen floor was covered in guns. I kept asking what had happened, but my family was firmly in the mindset of not telling children anything. As a child, I did not understand the danger, and because nothing happened to me directly, I forgot about the incident for years. I asked again, but they still would not talk about it. It is still scary to think that, had they wanted to, I could have died in my sleep that night. Story 30. A van carrying 6 passengers and a driver was on the way to an engagement. On a lonely road, the driver dozed off. He woke to find the van out of control. In the seconds he decided to save himself and jumped out through his door. The van went out of control, rolled, and crashed. 4 people in the van died on the spot. 1 person survived with minor fractures. Another barely survived. She had a skull fracture. The bones under her eyes were caved in. Glass was embedded in her eyes. Her nasal bones were broken. Her jaw was broken and she lost teeth. Her shoulder was broken and dislocated. Her hip was fractured, toes were broken, and a large area of skin was missing from her feet. She was rushed to the hospital and underwent multiple surgeries. She said the only thing that got her through was the thought that her children would otherwise grow up without a mother. When I saw her after surgery, she was completely wrapped in bandages, with only gaps for her eyes and a hole for her mouth. She could not speak for months and could not walk for a year. This was my mother, and the year was 2006. I was 9 or 10 then, and the memory of her wrapped, bandaged form still haunts my dreams. Story 31. There is a story about a woman who was found pushing her baby, who had been dead on a swing for 2 days. The baby died of hypothermia and dehydration. She was found not criminally responsible due to schizophrenia. Story 32. I had an associate who was a firefighter. He had to go find the head of his brother-in-law after a car accident. Then he had to console his sister when she heard. Tough bloke. Can you imagine that being your day? Story 33. I was a student director in my college's undergraduate student government. There was a student who volunteered for projects, so I assigned him many tasks. He seemed charismatic and well-dressed, and when he told me he owned a startup clothing company, I bought some items from his website. It was common for students in student government to attend the same parties, and I ran into him several times outside committee. During my senior year studying abroad, I saw an article online with his face on it. It turned out he had raped 12 women at my university. It had apparently been well known, but because his father was a wealthy professor, it kept getting swept under the rug. He was reportedly using extracurricular activities such as student government to keep returning to campus after being removed from his classes. Update. Abby Honnold tweeted there may have been as many as 17 victims, but she and another woman were the only ones who testified. My Snapchat feed was filled with women I knew sharing their experiences with him at the time. His father was wealthy and a professor, not a dean. That was my mistake. This happened 5 years ago. As a reminder, I was a student director in the undergraduate student-run government. Some people mistakenly assumed I was faculty. Story 34. My mother's best friend was driving home from work one night when a police officer pulled her over. She had no idea why but thought it might be a tail light, so she stopped. When the officer approached, he confirmed her tail light was out and asked for her license and registration. She handed them over and he returned to his patrol car for a while. When he came back, he began asking increasingly intrusive questions. At first he asked routine things like where she was going and where she had come from. Then he asked personal questions, whether she had a husband at home, any children, any weapons, any daughters, or any aggressive pets. When the questions became inappropriate, she told him so. He then became aggressive, shouting, "I am a police officer. Do you know what that means? It means you shut up and do what I say. Step out of the car." She was frightened. She rolled up the window and searched her purse for her phone. The officer pounded on the window and tried the door, shouting insults and profanities. In a panic, she pressed the gas and drove away. A short chase followed, but the officer stopped pursuing her as she neared the main road. She then called 911 and learned that no officers were supposed to be in that area. In the following days, it emerged that a rapist had been posing as an officer in the neighborhood. Her tail light was not broken. He had obtained her address, personal information, and knew about her husband and daughter. She had told him she did not own weapons, so she immediately purchased a pistol. She lived in fear until the man was finally caught. Story 35. The Lake Boda murders are frightening. Four teenagers went on a camping trip in Finland. The next morning, 3 were found murdered and the 4th was severely injured but survived. No one knows who the murderer is. 44 years later, the survivor, Nils, was accused of the murders and was imprisoned. He was released a year later because there was little deoxyribonucleic acid evidence and no strong proof of his guilt. Circumstantial evidence suggested he had fought with a friend after an argument while intoxicated. Some say this could have resulted in accidental or intentional killing. I highly doubt that Nils is guilty. I could not find much information on who Nils thought the murderer was. My thoughts are that either it is too traumatic for him to remember or he did not recognize the person. Other suspects include the camp manager, described as hostile, an ice cream vendor who allegedly confessed on his deathbed, and a man who lived nearby and claimed to have been in Germany at the time, a claim that is doubted. A sketch of the alleged murderer shows an unsettling older man, and a photograph exists of a man resembling the sketch attending a police presentation. Story 36. When I was about 8 years old, our school had swimming lessons as part of the curriculum. My mom worked late, so we stayed at after-school care and did not get home until after dark. She asked me to take my wet bathing suit and towel out to the clothesline to dry, so I could use them the next day. I felt confident and like a big kid as I walked into the backyard when a man started running toward me. I screamed, ran back inside, and instinctively locked the back door. My mom later told me she had heard him jump the gate next to her bedroom, heard my scream, and came running to find me. I slept with the light on until I was 16, and I still have my husband go outside for me when it is dark. Story 37. I lived with 3 other girls during my sophomore year of college. All 3 left early for spring break, leaving me alone in the house. On the first night alone, I heard someone bang on my front door at 2 a.m., then heard more knocks at the back door. A man yelled, "Boulder police, open the door." When I did not, I heard body slams against both doors. Soon I heard, "Little girl, open the door, we know you are alone." I was so scared I kept accidentally dialing 611 instead of 911. When I finally reached the police, patrol cars arrived just minutes later. Officers had 4 boys from our school hockey team lying face down on the grass. I had to file restraining orders against them. The kicker was that one of the boys lived across the street from me, and we had never spoken a single word before then. Story 38. Last year, there was a young woman named Ruth who attended the University of Illinois at Chicago. After leaving an event, she was catcalled by a man who followed her into a parking garage. He raped and killed her and then left her there. She had attended a high school near me, and it breaks my heart to recall the story. Story 39. I'm not sure I remember all the details correctly, but here is what happened. A worker was cleaning a giant cooking tank at a tuna factory. The tank was so large that he had to climb inside. Another worker failed to follow safety procedures, and the tank was locked and turned on while he was inside, causing his death. Story 40. Throwaway account trigger warning. Domestic violence. I used to be a police officer and this story is burned into my head, probably for the rest of my life. I was called to a caravan park. Neighbors had heard a woman screaming in one of the caravans all day, but we only received a call that night. I arrived with my partner. A huge, friendly man answered the door. He towered over me and completely blocked the entrance, so I could not see inside. I told him there had been complaints about a woman screaming. He said he and his wife had been arguing about something stolen from outside their caravan and that it was her fault. I thought that was a lie. He was outwardly friendly and pleasant. I would not leave without checking on the woman because we had to ensure everyone's safety. He hesitated at first, then moved out of the doorway. I saw her sitting on the bed, covered head to toe in clothing and wearing large sunglasses, which was odd because it was nighttime. I considered the possibility of drugs but doubted it. I asked if she was okay. She nodded but would not remove her glasses, and I could not force her to. I warned them about the arguing and told them to keep the noise down. I was still unhappy because I did not have enough evidence to make an arrest, so I went next door to ask if anyone had seen anything. The neighbors told me the woman was covered in bruises and needed to be taken to safety. They agreed to be witnesses and make statements, so I felt I had enough evidence to arrest him. I went back to the caravan, arrested the man, and put him in the back of my car. I then went to the woman, who immediately collapsed when she stood. We helped her back onto the bed, and she began removing her clothes and glasses. She was covered in bruises. Her face was swollen with black eyes. She had fresh blowtorch burns on her legs and stomach. There were large infected wounds from a screwdriver all over her body. I had never seen anything like it. That woman had been tied up in that small caravan for weeks, tortured every minute she was awake. What struck me was how pleasant this monster had been to deal with. You never know anything about a person until it is too late. We put him away for life without bail. We got her help and a new place in a recovery house for victims of domestic violence, and she is doing well. The saddest part is that she remained in love with him and asked if she would ever see him again. She was clearly brainwashed. Story 41. I'm not great at writing, but I hope everyone can read this. One night I was walking out of a Walmart when a man caught my attention and asked if I could give him a ride. I did not know him, and I do not give random strangers rides. He said he was a truck driver and wanted to go back to the gas station across the highway, literally within walking distance, so he could get to his big rig. I made up a made-up excuse so I would not give him a ride and suggested he could contact a ride-hailing service for help. He started yelling at me, saying it was just a ride and that he needed help. At that point I said, "I gotta go," turned and headed to my car. I heard him say, "Okay." I got into my car and drove off. Initially I felt extremely bad for not giving him a ride, but the way he yelled at me made me feel justified. I do not give strangers rides unless they are family or friends. Cut to almost a year later, I was at a restaurant eating lunch and opened Facebook on my phone. What I saw next shocked me to my core. The article showed a picture of the same man who had asked me for a ride that night, in a mugshot. It turned out he was a fugitive wanted on several murder charges across my state. One of the scariest things he did to trick people was ask for a ride, and once he and his victims were out of sight, he would kill them by shooting them, strip them of their money and clothing, then take their vehicle and travel to the next area to find another victim. I almost choked on my drink when I saw that. Edit. Thank you, everyone, for the upvotes. I'm glad you can read this, because I honestly thought it might not be understood right away. I'm not trying to discourage everyone from giving rides to strangers. There are good people who sometimes need help on the road, but there are also bad actors who make things difficult for good Samaritans. Be careful, especially with coronavirus disease 2019 circulating. It also helps if you are carrying a licensed firearm, if you understand what I mean. Be safe, everyone. Story 42. I worked at an animal hospital in Las Vegas and loved it. One day I heard something off over the radio while I was doing my rounds. We get a lot of feedback and it was a short transmission, but I was certain it sounded like someone screaming with a dog barking in the background. I was unsure, but I trusted my gut. I jogged to the main treatment building and looked in. No screaming, no panic. I decided to check the luxury boarding building where my boss Gabby was. He was silent. I trusted my gut again and walked further into the building, even though no one else seemed alarmed. At the end of the hall, I peered through the small plexiglass window in the door and saw blood smeared on the walls, floor, countertops, and doors. I froze for a second and then burst in. My 120-pound boss was between two pit bulls locked in a brutal fight. The dogs were clamped on each other and she was trying to pull them apart, repeatedly losing her footing on the blood-covered floor. I grabbed the attacking dog from behind by his collar while Gabby held the other dog, which was whining. It did not work. I started calling for help over the radio, screaming for about 10 seconds, before I dropped the radio to attend to the fight again. The aggressor unclamped and clamped down again on the other dog's neck. I was out of ideas and help was not coming, so I looked around and saw a 10-pound metal food bowl on the counter. I grabbed it, looked at my boss to see if she approved, and she said yes. I hit the dog 7 or 8 times until he let go and walked away. I took the wounded dog to treatment, furious and covered in blood, while others listened to easy rock with their radios off. Later that day, a receptionist asked me what all the noise on the radio had been. I asked what she meant and what she had heard. She said, "I heard someone screaming and saying there was an emergency, but I was with a client and it was really loud, so I turned it down. Of course, I was then assigned to clean up all the blood." Quit. Story 43. In the 1960s, a young woman had an affair with her boss and became pregnant. After she threatened to tell his wife, he killed her and placed her body in an industrial barrel, which he hid in his house for years. Subsequent owners did not open the barrel because of its weight. In the 1990s, a man decided to dispose of it, and when he opened it, he discovered the remains. An investigation traced the barrel and the woman back to the man, and deoxyribonucleic acid testing confirmed he was the father of the unborn child. He killed himself before police could arrest him. The woman's mother, in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter had finally been found, said she had dreamed for years that her daughter was inside a metal container. Story 44. One night my friends and I were drinking and asking, "Whatever happened to him?" We were talking about a young man several of us had as an aide in high school. A nice kid. I searched for him online. There were a couple of appellate court decisions among the first results. It turned out he had served in Afghanistan and was severely traumatized by combat. Court records said he had seen things there that completely undid him, and he returned home with post-traumatic stress disorder and delusional schizophrenia. After returning home, he apparently tried multiple times to kill his mother, believing he was saving her from demons and sending her to heaven. His social media was filled with long, manic posts about demons. It was sad to discover this, and it is not the only time I have found a former classmate who had lost his or her mind. It is terrifying to think someone can be considered normal and then, through a set of circumstances, become severely mentally ill within a few years. Story 45. I was in class in 10th grade when the teacher asked everyone how their weekend had been. The quietest girl in the class began to cry and said she had been on a trip to the mountains with her mother. They stopped at a lookout, and she looked over the cliff and saw an overturned vehicle with a deceased family scattered below. Story 46. I would not say it is the scariest one I know, but it was close to home. I received a call from my father asking if I was okay about half an hour after it happened. Recently, at my university, construction was underway on a new building. 3 men were standing on a large glass roof that was supposed to be stable. Long story short, it was not, and they fell through it. 2 men escaped unharmed, but a worker in his 20s was killed. It was a combination of a fatal fall and severe lacerations. An awful way to go. Story 47. A coworker's father was babysitting his baby boy. At one point, the grandfather went into the nursery to check on the baby and found that the baby had somehow reached for the window blind cord and become tangled in it to the point of choking. The baby was already blue and the veins in his face were very prominent. The grandfather frantically dialed the emergency number. Emergency medical services arrived in 2 to 3 minutes and revived the child. He is okay now. For parents, check how close to the crib any hanging cords are. When the child was taken to the hospital, staff separated and questioned the parents and grandfather repeatedly, as if they were suspected of causing the incident intentionally. It was determined to be a true accident. The child is now in his 20s and is well. Story 48. A few years ago, I worked at a bar near a forested area. One night at about 10 o'clock, a boy ran in screaming that his mother and father were trying to kill him. Shortly after, a woman and a man entered the bar, presumably his parents. They asked me if I had seen where their son had gone. I said no, and they left, muttering to themselves. I called the police. They arrived about 13 minutes later. The officers searched the area for the parents and took the child with them. That is all I remember. Story 49. There have been several confirmed cases in a few different countries of people living in other people's houses without the homeowner's knowledge. I believe one case went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner went to work, then sneak out and steal small amounts of food so it would not be noticed. Eventually, the homeowner noticed and could not figure out where his food was going, so he set up a hidden camera. I can only imagine how scary it would have been to come home from work one night, sit down to watch the video, skip through hours of stillness, and suddenly see a person crawling out of your attic, and then the slow realization that the person was still in your house at that moment. Then the retroactive fear of thinking back to all the times you lay awake at night and heard a noise you dismissed as coming from the pipes or the old wooden beams, when actually it was a person just above you. It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I think about it. Story 50. Back when I was much less wise than I am now, I briefly dated a man a work friend had introduced me to. We enjoyed each other's company and ended up in bed. Honestly, it was some of the best sex I had ever had. A couple of days later, he called my job and left a message with the receptionist. "I want nothing to do with you. Leave me alone and never call me again." That was strange, since I had never called him, but I figured his loss. A couple of weeks later, police found a girl stuffed in a well in the next town over. She had been beheaded. Not long after that, they arrested the man I had dated very briefly. He pleaded guilty. His reason for killing her? She would not sleep with him. Story 51. I was robbed at gunpoint in front of my house. The gun was pressed into the back of my head. He took my money and jewelry, then fled. He was arrested an hour later. Story 52. After reading these, I am never doing anything with anyone again. Story 53. A friend moved to Argentina a few years ago to teach for 1 year. To save money, she rented the cheapest place she could find. It turned out the cheapest place in Buenos Aires was also the most dangerous. On her first day there, she looked out the window just as a man ran up to another man on the street and shot him, then ran off. She found a new place the next day. Story 54. My baby's crib caught fire in the middle of the night. It was a literal worst nightmare. My baby was in the crib. He was severely burned and spent a month intubated and in a medically induced coma. He is 5 now and he is okay. The fire was a freak accident. His humidifier caught fire, smoldered for a short time, and drained the oxygen in the room before the smoke alarm went off. When we opened the door to his room, the room flooded with oxygen, creating a backdraft that launched a fireball at his crib. The next day, this was the condition of his crib. Many people asked which humidifier and which company. I cannot elaborate further. A freak accident can occur with any electrical appliance, from refrigerators to table lamps. This specific accident involved a humidifier, but the nature of the accident is not exclusive to humidifiers. Check your appliances and maintain them. Discard any appliance that develops issues, and follow any safety instructions included with it. Also, make sure your smoke alarms are in working order. They could save a life. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.